Hey guys, this is Miss Willis. I cannot believe this is our last lesson of the year. I really appreciate those of you who have still worked hard outside of school and have been continuing to do these lessons at home and watch the videos and do the extra work and things like that. That just shows that you really care and you really give that extra effort. So I really appreciate you. We ended last week with the lives of the soldiers and how the Civil War was affecting the African Americans and women's role during the war. And then this week we're going to look at how this war ended and the last battles and then what happened right after. So we're going to start there. Okay, so it says how the North won. And last week you started a simulation of the Civil War, and then this week we're going to finish that up. So first I want to start with, in December of 1862 there was a battle of Fredericksburg, and this was a huge victory for the South. So at this point in the war, the South had been holding their own pretty strong, and so they had won this huge victory. And so now we're going to pick up in July of 1863. So just about half a year later, we're at the Battle of Gettysburg. So that's where we'll start. So the Battle of Gettysburg was fought in Pennsylvania, and this is probably one of the most famous battles of the entire Civil War. It lasted 3 days. The Confederates, remember, which is the South, was led by Robert E. Lee, and 150 cannons were fired at the Union, and the Union returned fire. And so the amount of cannons being used, it said that this battle could be heard 140 miles away. So people that were in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, could hear this battle taking place. A Confederate general named George Pickett, he led a charge with the Confederate soldiers called Pickett's Charge. And this was a disaster of a charge because the Union was holding their ground, and 5,000 Confederates were casualties were a result of the Pickett's Charge. So this victory for the Union, they held their own, and they outnumbered the Confederates. So this was an important victory because it stopped the Confederates from advancing, and the North was able to make the South retreat back to Virginia. So whereas Lee had led them all the way up into Pennsylvania in the northern states, now they're going to retreat back to the South. The casualties here, the Union had 23,000 casualties. The Confederate had 28,000. So just in this one Battle of Gettysburg, 51,000 casualties. So you can imagine this field of Americans versus Americans. It was just mass numbers of casualties here and deaths. So in response to that, the field in Gettysburg was turned into a national cemetery to honor the men that had died there. And so President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, went to give a speech in November of 1863. He went to give a speech to honor all those that had died at Gettysburg and to turn it into a national cemetery. And his speech inspired the Union. It reminded them that uniting the nation again and ending slavery were things worth fighting for. I'm going to attach the Gettysburg Address. It's a very short speech. It's one of Lincoln's shortest speeches, but it was extremely inspirational. You may have heard it before when it starts, the 407 years ago. That's like the first line of it. So I'm going to attach that as some extra bonus reading in there for you. Now the tide turns. After this victory at Gettysburg, the Union start to go on a roll, and they start to accomplish, remember the Anaconda Plan? They start to accomplish all the steps of that Anaconda Plan. So one day after the Battle of Gettysburg is won, another battle's going on over at the Mississippi River, and the Union's going to win that as well. So the Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is right on the east of the river bank, Union forces are led by Ulysses S. Grant, and he puts up a blockade at the city and begins firing on the city, and it lasts 48 days. So for 48 days, Vicksburg, Mississippi is under fire. The Confederates are literally being starved to death during this 48 days. The whole city is starving, even the civilians, which is the people that are just, the kids, the women, the people back home in the city. And on July 4th, 1863, the day after the surrender of Gettysburg, the Southerners surrender Vicksburg. The city of Vicksburg was starving so badly that the butcher shops even started selling rats. Can you imagine if you go to a butcher shop to buy your meat for your house and the only thing they have to sell is rats? So the blockade and the attacking for over a month led to them just having to surrender. So the South had been cut in half, just like the Anaconda Plan had been predicted. So Ulysses S. Grant is given control of all the Union forces at this point. So Robert E. Lee is head of the South and the Confederates, and Ulysses S. Grant is now in control of the Union forces. Now, General William Sherman. Whew, he is a bad dude, but he gets the job done. So he marches his army towards Atlanta, Georgia. So he is a general for the Union, and he marches towards Atlanta, Georgia, and he overtakes the city in September of 64. They march then 300 miles, and they have a width of 60 miles wide, and they march a path for 300 miles, 60 miles wide, and their goal is just to destroy everything in their path. This strategy is called total war. Total war's goal is not just to defeat the enemy, but it is to destroy the people's will to fight by destroying families, homes, livestock, crops. Their goal is to destroy everything and make the opponent just give up and lose all hope. So that's what they did for 300 miles. They marched and destroyed railroads, barns, fields, crops, homes, plantations, everything. They did $100 million worth of damage. And this is known as Sherman's March to the Sea, because he was marching from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. So total war was used also by the British in the Revolutionary War that we talked about. So when they get to Savannah, Savannah fell without any fight at all. Sherman's army joins up with Grant's, and then they're going to head up to surround Lee's army in Virginia. When Savannah fell, Sherman got in touch with the President Lincoln, and it fell in December 21st on 1864, and he got in touch with President Lincoln, and he said basically, Merry Christmas, I've got you the city of Savannah, Georgia as your Christmas present. So now he's going to join up with Grant's army, and they're going to close in on Lee in Virginia. And remember, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia is the capital for the Confederates right now. So on April 3rd, 1865, they capture Richmond, which is the Confederates' capital. And President Lincoln even comes to see this capturing of the Confederate capital. And when he gets there, the city's former slaves cheered for him, because remember, he had done the Emancipation Proclamation. So Lee has 55,000 in his Confederate troop that they're tired and they are starving. They're out of supplies because of the blockade. They're out of food. Grant has over 113,000 soldiers, and they're still going pretty strong. And when he combines with Sherman's troops, they're even larger in number. So Lee had nothing else to do but surrender. And he told his men, I would rather die 1,000 deaths than have to surrender, but I don't have another choice. So he meets, let me go back here. So he meets at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia to talk over the surrender guidelines with Grant. So Lee and Grant sit down. Lee, the Confederate leader, surrenders to Grant, the Union leader. And Grant handled it very unconventionally. He was very merciful to Lee. And he said, your soldiers can go free. They can keep their personal weapons. They can even keep their horses. And then he said, I know your men are starving. Sit down and eat. And he gave the Union's food supply. He gave some of the food to the Confederate soldiers. And then when he went back, the Union Army started cheering because they had just won. And Grant told them, don't cheer, because now those men are our countrymen again. Those rebels are now back to being our own people again, because this war is over. So Ulysses S. Grant gave a very peaceful, merciful surrender deal for the Confederate soldiers. So during this war, 620,000 soldiers died. Towns are destroyed. The farms are destroyed. Industries are destroyed. The devastation of the country in the South was just unreal. And Lincoln was crushed. He was hurt because the South was also part of America. It was part of the nation they had wanted to build. And so he expressed sympathy for the South. He even played one of the Southern tunes, Dixie. And he said, our next step of business is going to be to rebuild our nation, united once again. And I'm going to help rebuild the South now that this war is over. And that was going to be called an era of Reconstruction period. So during Reconstruction, Lincoln has some plans. His first plan is to end slavery. And then his next plan is to readmit the Confederate States back into the Union to reunite everyone. Well, not long after Reconstruction starts, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, which means murdered. And when it's a government official or a political leader. And so on April 14th, 1865, just a little bit after, the surrender, he is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. I've actually been to the place where Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was assassinated. I've actually been there and seen that. So Abraham Lincoln is killed, and it was a huge deal for the country. Booth was a Confederate who disagreed with Lincoln's views. And Andrew Johnson was the vice president at the time, so he takes over as president. Now, he is a Southerner from Tennessee, but he's going to help carry out the Reconstruction plans that Lincoln had in place. So step one, end slavery. So the 13th Amendment is passed in December of 1865. Remember, the 13th Amendment ends slavery throughout the entire nation. And then his next step is to readmit the Confederate States into the Union. Well, to do that, he does it in a very kind of easy way, I guess, not very forceful way. And a lot of people thought he was letting the southern states off the hook too easy. And so he said they had to follow federal guidelines, they had to agree to end slavery, all this. But the way he had it planned, they could still pass black codes. And those black codes put a lot of restrictions on African Americans, even if they were free. So Congress takes over the Reconstruction because they don't trust Johnson to be doing a good job at it. So once Congress takes over Reconstruction, they become much more forceful. So they passed the Reconstruction Act in 1867, which gave African Americans men the right to vote. Confederate officers and leaders could not vote or hold office. So they put restrictions on the South and then helped to give less restrictions to African Americans. They set up the Freedmen's Bureau, which helped save former slaves, helped make their lives a little bit more equal. And even by 1870, finally, African Americans are even allowed to be elected into higher political roles. So one of the first was Hiram Revels. He was elected senator from Mississippi. And then Blanche Bruce was elected to the Senate in 1874, and he was actually a former slave. Well, the Southerners were furious because they'd also sent in federal troops to make sure the South was abiding by all this and that they weren't discriminating against the freed slaves. So the Southerners were angry, and some of the Northerners were moving down south to start opening and building industries and during this Reconstruction state. And they didn't like the Northerners moving in. They called them carpetbaggers because they carried like carpet cloth suitcases. So that was their nickname for the Northerners moving into the South. They didn't like the changes that Reconstruction was bringing, and they called any Southerners who did support Reconstruction scalawags, basically like traitors. And they didn't like the rights given to African Americans during this time, and some of the Southerners started forming groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which showed all kinds of evil towards the African Americans, would burn crosses on their lawns, and would do all kinds of damage to these African Americans with this mask on their faces. New amendments during this time. The South had to accept 2 new amendments in order to be readmitted into the Union. The 14th Amendment, which gave African Americans citizenship and said that laws must protect them as equal citizens, and the 15th Amendment, which gave all citizens the right to vote. So now African American men could vote. Johnson fought the 14th Amendment and the Reconstruction laws because he said that the southern states weren't rightfully represented and didn't get a vote and a say-so in this part of the Congress's decision. And Congress thought that was awful of him, so they wanted to impeach him, which means, remove him from office. So they fought to do that, which by 1 vote, he did not get impeached. So Reconstruction finally comes to an end. All former Confederate states are readmitted by 1870. New laws are passed that took away rights of African Americans. Poll taxes to vote, reading tests to vote, and Jim Crow laws, which separate African Americans and whites in public places. So some of the things that they had fought to make African Americans equal got reversed by other things. So they said, okay, well, you can vote, But in order to vote, you've got to pass a reading test. Well, we know a lot of the African American slaves weren't allowed to learn to read, so then they couldn't vote either. So they found all these little loopholes and ways around it of still treating them very unequal. And then the Jim Crow laws, which made it segregation, where, like, for schools, African Americans had to go to one school and the whites had to go to another school. And so their lives, although they were free, were not much better at this point. Sharecropping was big at this point. That was where you rented land from wealthier white landowners, and then you paid for your rent with a portion of your crop. And then whatever you had left over, you could use for your own clothing and equipment and food and to live on. So it was basically still what they were doing when they were slaves. And usually the costs were higher than the pay that they would receive for their crops. So they weren't ever to ever make money. So during this time, Reconstruction successes, public school system was established, industries were expanded, even down into the South. But failures, the South remained the poorest section of the whole country. African Americans lost their political power. They continued to perform the same labor as they had before as slaves for very little money or none. And so a lot of people would consider the Reconstruction time to have not been what they hoped for Reconstruction to have been. It didn't do in the South what they'd hoped for. Basically, the Civil War damage that it had done to the South, it was just hard to come back from that. Okay, now in 6th grade, you're going to pick up right here after the Civil War and the Reconstruction. You'll pick up there in the 6th grade with the history. So on your simulation, if you did what I asked you to do last week, you stopped here at the Emancipation Proclamation slide. So on the simulation, remember you had chosen to be a Confederate or a Union soldier, and then you went through, watched videos if you could, you read the information, you chose your fate, and then you typed in answers where you could. So now this week, I'm just going to ask you to finish it up. There's only like 10 more slides. So you're going to finish it up starting with slide 74. Remember, you can be in this editing, the editing part to type. You can type directly in there by double clicking, or if you hit the, and then you hit the present mode to go through and actually click and read and select videos and things like that. So once you get to the end of this and you've filled out all the slides, you typed in your answers, then you can share it to me. And that is your final assignment. So when you get to the end, which is this last slide here, you are done. It just says if you click this little part right here, then you can see all the slides and make sure you typed in the ones you were supposed to type into. Check yourself real quick and then hit share to CC Willis, and I'll get your last assignment in there. And I cannot believe that this is the last week of your 5th grade year. I hope that you had a good year. I'm gonna miss you guys. I know that it was a year cut short, so that's kind of sad. Maybe some of y'all are happy about that. I don't know. But we've loved getting to know you guys. I've loved getting to know y'all. I love y'all. I hope you have a great summer. I hope you continue to work hard so you'll be ready for 6th grade. And I will see y'all next year. If you have any questions or anything, just feel free to always email me. And then I hope to get some hugs from y'all when school starts back in 6th grade. All right, y'all have a great summer. Love y'all. Bye.